What if I told you there was a secret to beating any enrage or a way to skip the hardest mechanics of certain fights, even on a first time clear? And no, I'm not talking about replacing your Reaper with a monk or refusing to bring a machinist. Instead, I'm going to tell you the #1 thing your static can do to improve overall team damage when tackling the toughest challenges in Final Fantasy XIV raids. I'm Karastar, a healer main and Sage enthusiast, and I'm talking about the extraordinary importance and potential of combined healer damage. In contrast to the "I'm a healer, not DPS," or "healer damage doesn't matter" babies on the forums and in YouTube comments, healers who can optimize and prog on the fly are the single greatest weapons a party has when it comes to beating the most difficult enrages in the game. But first, take a second to like this video and subscribe so I can stop using clickbait thumbnails and cringe YouTube titles to get noticed. Alright, first of all, notice how I said high combined healer damage. Healer is a support role in Final Fantasy XIV raiding, and as such is not judged purely on personal DPS contribution. Healing in this game is a partnership, and if you really want to gauge your value as a healer, it's important to look not only at your own damage, but also healer combined damage, which ranks you and your co-healer against healer partnerships with similar jobs. Now, unfortunately, finding individual success as a healer is pretty straightforward. You keep your GCD rolling, and you simply don't heal. But while chatting your co-healer, or even taking turns chatting each other, might give you some pretty individual numbers on FF logs, it's a far cry from optimal healer gameplay. Healer combined damage, however, requires both healers to map out heals and cooldowns, and even the rest of the party to coordinate mitigation in order to maximize healer damage output. Okay, cool, you might think, but getting pinks as a healer isn't exactly hard, and why are we looking at parses anyway? How does this relate to prog, and how does this information enable you to beat every enrage? In a group of moderate to good players, tanks and DPS are already doing optimal or near optimal rotations. Perhaps the strat you're doing in prog gives a GCD of melee downtime, or tanks are involving something they could instead plan defenses for, but for the most part their rotation, and thus their damage, does not change from pool to pool. Healers, however, without fight knowledge, play completely differently. Every single long cast gets a shield the first time you see it, because you simply don't know the damage output of the incoming attack, or even what the attack does at first, and anytime the party is low, you top them immediately, because you never know what damage is just on the horizon. Now, most of the time you can clear fights this way. Even in week 1 prog, the consistency of your tanks and DPS make up for the safety shields and heals you and your co-healer throw out to keep everyone alive, and early turns are not tuned tightly enough for this to matter a lot of the time. Everything changes, however, when you hit your first enrage. Now, sometimes the answer is simply play better, do the mechanics correctly, be more consistent, don't die. But what happens when that's not enough? What happens when the fight simply demands more than your party is able to currently give? Well, break out your abacus, because this is where healer optimization really shines. To illustrate this, let's look at the DPS differences between healer partnerships at various percentiles. We will look at the 25th percentile, or green, the 50th, or blue, and the 75th, or purple. We're going to ignore the 95th and 99th for now, because gear is going to make those numbers more dramatic, but it's definitely possible to get a purple with nowhere near BIS. So right now the 25th, 50th, and 75th are the most relevant to a prog setting. At the 25th percentile on the P8S door boss over the past 2 weeks, a Sage and White Mage healer partnership produces 9,649 RDPS. At the 50th percentile, this same duo puts out 10,182 RDPS, an increase of 533. Finally, at the 75th percentile, this number increases to 10,770, which is 588 higher than the 50th and 1,121 higher than the 25th. But that's Sage and White Mage, jobs without raid buffs that can't capitalize as well on an overall strong team. Astro and Scholar, with their respective raid buffs, at the 25th percentile put out 9,871 RDPS. At the 50th percentile, that number rises to 10,494 RDPS, a 623 RDPS increase. At the 75th, the RDPS output grows to 11,273, a full 779 higher than the 50th, and a dramatic 1,420 RDPS higher than the 25th. Now, I'm sure you've heard a lot about meta comps or comp changes to beat enrages, right? People being locked down of of playing their favorite jobs or becoming literally enraged when they have to switch jobs to beat an enrage? Well, let's examine the effect of switching a player from one job to another versus healers simply optimizing their damage output. Dancer is by far the superior Fizz ranged option in the P8S door boss, outstretching Bard on most tiers and leaving the lowly Machinist in the dust. In the P8S door boss, Dancer is 207 RDPS ahead of Machinist at the 25th percentile, 246 RDPS ahead at the 50th percentile, and 380 RDPS ahead at the 75th, a clear show of superiority. So sure, switching from the 75th percentile Machinist to a 75th percentile Dancer will give your party a boost of 380 RDPS, a noticeable advantage. But remember what the increases looked like for healers who optimized? By coordinating their heals as a team to maximize their damage, the Sage and White Mage increased their RDPS by up to 1,121, and the Scholar and Astro increased their RDPS 1,420. Don't think that's a fair statistical comparison? Sorry to break it to you, but a lot of times the only difference between a green and a purple healer is GCD uptime and the number of GCD heals cast during the encounter. Two things that are easily improved on. Making those kind of damage output leaps by learning proper planning and to always be casting is far from unheard of once pointed out. I would know. Alright, if you're still watching this, you're probably convinced by now of the potential of healer combined damage, but maybe you just don't know where to start. Well, what I've always found effective is to use a spreadsheet to map out where your party's major and minor mitigations and heals should be used against a timeline of the fight. Now, don't be overwhelmed. A lot of times people scoff at spreadsheeting a fight, not wanting to create a rigid plan for their runs or thinking that it only applies to the upper echelon of raiders. However, because healer OGCD heals and mitigations have specific and distinct cooldowns, if you don't plan where you should use them, you may find yourself without the proper OGCD tools to effectively handle the situation, causing you to resort to GCD heals and shields, and thus reducing your damage as a result. Similarly, if you don't know that your co-healer can easily handle the mitigation or healing required on their own, or you don't have a plan to effectively manage the healing and mitigation required together, you will inevitably overheal or over-mitigate when it is unnecessary. You've also probably been heal planning at some level just without writing it down. Here's an example of a mitigation spreadsheet from this past tier. If you're blind progging, you're going to need to make your own timelines, but I got this timeline made by Solaren's Everwind on Gilgamesh week 1, and it works just fine. What you can see is, for P5S, there's really not much there, because this fight was heal planned essentially by feel. I realized pretty quickly that there are a number of back-to-back raid-wides throughout the fight that are effectively healed and mitigated almost entirely via Kara and Holos. In contrast, here's our P8S Phase 2 heal and mitigation plan from Prague, which could not be more different. So let's break down how to approach this puzzle. The trick to laying out a heal plan is to understand what your biggest tools are and what their cooldowns look like. So let's focus on Aoe Tools using Sage as an example. As a Sage, you have a free 10% mit and regen every 30 seconds in Kara, another regen with a heal buff every 60 seconds in Physis, the recently buffed Holos that is a heal, shield, and 10% mitigation all in one every 2 minutes, the dramatically strong Panheima with its 5 stacks of shields every 2 minutes, and Numa, a DPS neutral heal that is easily buffed to 900 potency with Zoe every 2 minutes as well. That means when you're looking at a timeline of a fight, every 2 minutes you should be able to use Kara roughly 4 times, Physis twice, and Holos, Panheima, and Numa each once. Now, it doesn't always work out this way because sometimes you want to save specific tools for specific boss attacks, and it is more valuable to use the tools on those boss attacks, even if it means losing a use overall. But this is an effective way to attack the puzzle of what goes where within each 2-minute time frame. The next step is to identify what the boss attacks do so you can better address them with the tools that you have at your disposal. Ion, and no, I'm not going to try to pronounce the full attack name, is a medium hitting raid wide that applies a party-wide bleed. You can see from this plan that I addressed this attack with a pre-pull buffed party-wide GCD shield, 2 regens with Kara and Physis, including the 10% mit from Kara and Panheima. Now, this is most certainly overkill, but I'm able to do it because there's nothing else in the first 1 minute that I need to use Physis for, and nothing else in the first 2 minutes that I need to use Panheima for because of coordination with my co-healer. Holos handles the heal up between the stack and spread while applying a shield and mit. Numa handles the top up between the fire and ice, and by the time the next Ion comes out, Kara's 10% is still up for the initial hit, Physis is back, and my my co-healer's Liturgy of the Bell does a lot of the heavy lifting. Alternating Panheima and Bell in a White Mage and Sage comp is a great example of the need for healer coordination, because these tools are incredibly strong for both the P7S and P8S final boss raid-wide bleeds, but without planning which healer tackles which bleed, you could find yourself in a situation where both healers use Panheima and Bell on the first bleed and then have nothing left in the tank for the second. Now you'll notice in all of that there is only one GCD healer shield, and it occurred before the fight even started. Realistically, a Sage could single target shield or heal both people with debuffs and AoE shield as many as 6 more times before the first stack and spread, before the second stack and spread, before the first fire ice, before the second fire ice, before the second ion, and before high concept. That's potentially up to 8 GCDs not put into doses, or 2,640 potency lost, which would be like losing the equivalent of 5 phlegmas in a 2-minute time frame, not to mention the MP cost, which would call for higher piety gear sets and an even greater damage loss. Remember, that's 2,640 potency loss in only the first 2 minutes. Removing 2.5 minutes of downtime from the fight, there's a total of roughly 6 minutes of uptime. So if you played the rest of the fight similarly safe, that could result in approximately 7,920 potency lost over the entire course of the fight. Said another way, by planning your free healing, shielding, and mitigation tools effectively, you can gain up to 7,920 potency throughout the fight. Now, whether or not your tank presses Rampart, or your melee presses Feint, or your caster presses Addle, nothing they can do gains them that kind of potency. I know, healers, I know. It's bad enough that you feel like you have to make up for party members not using their one mitigation button, while you have to worry about rotating and planning out 7 or so of your own that all look the same. But when you finally figure it out, not only do you do more damage individually, and not only does your healer combined damage skyrocket as a result, but your overall team even improves. Everyone knows from the spreadsheet exactly where their mitigation goes and are accountable for deaths when that mitigation is missed. The overall team damage improves dramatically, and most importantly, enrages are left in the dust. Enjoy this video? Well, optimized healer combined damage is useful even in fights without strict DPS checks. Click on this clear VOD of my static skipping Kachexia at 2 week 1 to see an example of high DPS allowing you to skip mechanics in prog. Also, click on my face to subscribe and get notified of the next video.